Oye, mira, it's Christian Ortiz, and this is Cape On, a tech activist podcast. Recently, I wrote an article called The Silent Labor of BIPOC Speakers, How Unpaid Speaking Engagements Perpetuate Tokenization and Exploitation in the Conference Circuit. I wrote this for my Oye Mira newsletter on LinkedIn. I also recently created a guide called Unlearning Bias Guide, where it focuses on understanding and dismantling biases, including all of the isms, offering examples of both extreme and subtle forms of discrimination. Today, a friend of mine, Tara Thompson on LinkedIn, who's an AI workshop leader, created a video highlighting two brand new AI systems, Napkin.ai and NotebookLM.Google. After reviewing her video, I wanted to take my documents and see if I could actually create a podcast-style breakdown conversation between two people using the contents of my documents. I mean, what better way to decolonize AI than to feed it decolonized information? The following is a podcast-style conversation between two individuals about my content, created by NotebookLM, meaning that everything you're about to hear was created by AI.
You know, it's funny how often people get asked to do things just like for the exposure.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's legit, right?
Yeah.
But then sometimes it just feels like, are you asking me to donate my time, my talent, my work? Especially, well, if you're, not a white guy.
Yeah.
And that's what we're diving into today, right? The hidden costs of these, like, quote unquote, amazing opportunities and how they really disproportionately impact BIPOC voices.
Right.
And this isn't just about conferences. This is about understanding these deeper societal patterns that I think impact all of us.
Yeah. It's fascinating how something as, I guess normal or common as a speaking gig can reveal so much about, these deeper societal structures. So yeah, we're going to really unpack how this all works, looking at the hard numbers and then also the less tangible but equally important emotional toll this takes.
Okay, so let's unpack this. We've got some seriously eye-opening research here, some excerpts from an article that takes a deep dive into the experiences of BIPOC speakers at conferences. And then we also have a guide that we're going to be pulling from that defines key terms like tokenism and systemic oppression.
Yeah.
And it even breaks them down with real-world examples, which I think is really, really helpful.
Yeah, and I want to emphasize that those examples are crucial because we're going to get into the nuances of how seemingly small actions or microaggressions or things that people might not even realize contribute to these larger systems of inequality.
Right.
Because oftentimes these things are perpetuated because people just don't even realize what they're participating in.
It's like we all know blatant racism is wrong, but what about the stuff that flies under the radar?
Right.
Yeah, that's where it gets really interesting and frankly, a little uncomfortable.
Yeah.
But hey, that's how we learn and grow, right?
Absolutely. Knowledge is power, especially when it comes to dismantling these systems.
Okay, so get this. This article drops a bomb, right?
Yeah.
It says that a whopping 60% of BIPOC speakers get absolutely $0.
Wow.
No travel, no fees waived, nothing for speaking at major conferences.
A shocking statistic, to be sure, but sadly not surprising when you consider the broader context. So if we connect this to the racial wealth gap, you see a very clear pattern of economic injustice emerging.
Right.
This practice essentially forces BIPOC professionals to subsidize these conferences with their expertise, their time, and oftentimes very personal stories of overcoming obstacles.
And just to drive that point home, Black Americans hold only 15% of the wealth of white Americans.
Right.
That's a massive, massive gulf, and it doesn't happen by accident.
Exactly. And so when we talk about, BIPOC speakers not being paid, it's not just an individual issue. It's feeding into this much larger problem of systemic economic disparity. And it's making it significantly harder for these individuals to build wealth, to advance in their careers, and really just break free from a system that is, in many ways, stacked against them.
And it's not just about the money.
Right.
Imagine pouring your heart and soul into a talk, reliving potentially really painful experiences in order to educate others, and getting nothing but a pat on the back.
Right, precisely. What we're talking about here is this often overlooked concept of emotional labor.
Okay.
Dr. Joy DeGruy, who is an expert on the psychological impacts of trauma, puts it so powerfully when she says, quote, "Every time we recount our trauma for the sake of education, we relive it."
Wow. Yeah, that really hits home. You're expected to be vulnerable, to educate, to basically do the work of dismantling these systems, all while often shouldering the financial burden as well. It's like a double whammy.
Yes, and sociological research even points to something called performance burnout,
Oh, wow.
which is especially prevalent in situations like this. Imagine feeling pressured to be on and emotionally available all the time, especially in spaces where you might not feel fully accepted or, safe. That constant pressure to perform can really lead to burnout, especially for BIPOC individuals who are essentially performing emotional labor on a public stage, often with little to no recognition or support.
So we've seen how these unpaid speaking gigs, they're not just like a one-off thing. They really kind of feed into these financial disparities.
Right.
But the costs really do go beyond the dollar amount. It's the emotional toll that this practice takes on BIPOC individuals.
Exactly.
And how that reinforces these like deeper systems of inequality.
Yeah, and one of the key ways this plays out is through something called tokenism.
Tokenism. Okay, so for those of us who haven't really encountered that term before, break it down.
Yeah, absolutely. So the term actually comes from the work of Rosabeth Moss Kanter, who studied how minority groups are treated in predominantly white spaces. And what she found is that often it's not about genuine inclusion, it's about, ticking boxes.
So like having that one BIPOC person on a panel just to, look good and show they care about diversity. I've seen that happen.
Exactly. You might see a BIPOC speaker on a panel about diversity, but how often do you see them headlining a conference about, artificial intelligence or economics or something like that?
Right. It's like their expertise is being narrowed down to just their identity.
Exactly. And that's where this guide that we mentioned earlier becomes so valuable, because it actually provides concrete examples of how tokenism and, by extension, racism and white supremacy manifest in both extreme and subtle ways.
Okay.
So it's not just about, outright discrimination, but these more insidious, everyday things that oftentimes go unnoticed.
Like what? Can you give us an example?
Yeah, so think about those backhanded compliments that people think are okay, complimenting a Black person by saying that they're articulate, as if that's something unexpected.
Right.
Or assuming that an Asian person would be a natural fit for a math-related role.
Oh, yeah.
It's these everyday biases that oftentimes go unchecked, but they really do build up. Wow.
And they create an unequal playing field.
I'd never even thought about it like that before. But yeah, I can definitely see how that would make someone feel boxed in. Have you ever experienced that yourself?
Oh, absolutely. I think for many BIPOC individuals, these are experiences that, unfortunately, we encounter all too often. And that's why it's so important to talk about them, bring them to light, so we can really start to dismantle these harmful patterns.
Yeah. It's like death by 1,000 paper cuts.
Yeah.
You might not even realize how much damage is being done until you really step back and look at the whole picture.
Okay, so we've covered some pretty heavy stuff.
Yeah.
Where do we go from here? What can we as individuals actually do to change this system?
Yeah, that's the big question, right? So Christian Ortiz, the author of the article that we've been discussing, actually offers some really concrete steps that I think are helpful.
Give them to me.
Okay, so first and foremost, we have to start paying all speakers fairly, right?
Yeah.
And that pay scale needs to be transparent.
Okay.
No more hiding behind exposure as a currency, especially when we're talking about professional expertise and, as we discussed, oftentimes very demanding emotional labor.
It's like, saying, we value your expertise so little, we won't pay you for it.
Not cool. Exactly. And it shouldn't be up to the speakers to have to negotiate this every single time. It should be standard practice across the board. The second thing that Ortiz highlights is the need to make travel and accommodation a non-negotiable for all speakers. Again, particularly for those who are already facing systemic economic disadvantages. Having to bear the cost of attending these conferences is it's unacceptable.
Creating a barrier to entry.
Yeah.
It's like, oh yeah, we want diverse voices, but only if you can afford to be here.
Exactly. And then finally, and perhaps most importantly, we need to move beyond tokenism to genuine inclusion, right?
Okay, so how do we actually do that? What does that look like in practice?
Okay.
How do we actually do that? What does moving beyond tokenism to genuine inclusion actually look like in practice?
Well, I think it starts with, not just inviting BIPOC speakers to talk about diversity,
Right.
but actually valuing their expertise across the board,
Okay.
So, imagine like a tech conference, for example, right?
Yeah.
Where you have BIPOC speakers, not just on a panel about diversity in tech, but like giving keynote speeches about the latest advancements in artificial intelligence or like leading workshops on, cutting edge software development.
So it's recognizing that their expertise isn't limited to just their identity.
Exactly. It's about creating a space where they have genuine influence and the power to actually shape the conversation, not just contribute to a predetermined narrative.
Right.
It's about like whose voices are being amplified, what topics are being discussed, and who has the power to decide those things.
Yeah. And that's on all of us to change, right? We can't just like sit back and wait for someone else to fix it.
Exactly. It's a journey, not a destination, and it requires a commitment to learning, unlearning, and actively challenging our own biases. Like even just like next time you're putting together a panel or a conference,
right,
think critically about like, okay, who are we inviting to speak and on what topics?
Yeah, it's about being intentional and making sure that we're creating spaces that are truly inclusive and representative of the world we want to live in. This has been a lot to take in, but super, super important.
Yeah.
For those wanting some like practical guidance on this, I highly, highly recommend checking out the Unlearning Bias Guide that we've been referencing. It's seriously packed with insights and action steps we can all take to really start dismantling these harmful systems.
Absolutely, yeah. It's on all of us to be part of the solution.
We can't just talk the talk, we have to walk the walk.
Family, I hope you found this episode quite entertaining, both in the context of my content, decolonizing AI, and to see what wondrous things AI can do. Until next time, Cape on.